Under Nazi rule, life wasn't just about war, it was survival under surveillance, censorship, and fear. Ordinary civilians lived through propaganda, loyalty tests, and silence. Teachers, mothers, students, each faced impossible choices. This is the untold story of daily life inside Hitler's regime. Compliance, resistance, and the fight to endure. In Germany, January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler becomes chancellor, and with him, the end of the Weimar Republic. Many celebrate. After years of hyperinflation and political unrest, the Nazis promise order, revival, and restored pride. Jobs return, banners rise, the nation marches in step. But as the economy recovers, freedoms vanish. Dissent turns dangerous. Neighbors disappear overnight. Radios echo only one voice. In classrooms and churches, Nazi ideology seeps into every word, every lesson, every sermon. Fear becomes ordinary. Through this story, we enter the private world of civilians caught in the tightening grip of dictatorship. Elizabeth Caseman, a pastor's daughter, quietly questions what others accept. Victor Klemperer, a Jewish philologist, records each law, each humiliation in meticulous detail. Sophie Scholl, a university student, dares to speak through forbidden leaflets. Margarete Buber-Neumann survives imprisonment by both the Nazis and the Soviets. Not the war rooms or front lines, but kitchens, classrooms, and prison cells. That's where history happened. In moments of doubt, silence, quiet defiance. In choices no one should have to make. These lives remind us the Nazi regime wasn't only imposed from above, it was absorbed, resisted, and endured, one civilian at a time. Promise and Paranoia, 1933 to 1936. The Third Reich didn't seize power overnight. It crept in through familiar streets, polite conversations, and everyday routines. For many Germans, the Nazi rise felt less like a revolution and more like an unsettling rearrangement of the furniture in their lives. Familiar institutions remained, churches, schools, post offices, but their interiors changed. Words were replaced, expectations rewired, and silences thickened. Elizabeth Caseman was a young schoolgirl when her father, a Lutheran pastor, refused to let his church be absorbed into the state-controlled German Christians movement. He joined the Confessing Church, a network of clergy opposing Nazi interference. Elizabeth felt this defiance at home, in murmured prayers, in conversations that stopped when visitors arrived, in her mother's guarded looks. But at school, the tone was different. Her teachers spoke with rigid authority about racial destiny and national pride. She was praised for saluting the flag and memorizing Hitler's speeches. One identity was taught in the classroom, another was whispered over dinner. She learned early how to live a divided life. Victor Klemperer, a Jewish professor of Romance languages in Dresden, chronicled the shifting landscape with clinical precision. In 1935, after being forced from his university post, he began documenting his daily humiliations. Each month brought new restrictions. Jews were barred from libraries, from theaters, from owning pets, from using park benches. He noticed how even language bent under the pressure. Words like fanatic became virtues. Obedience replaced ethics. Klemperer's diary did not shout, it watched. It recorded the mundane machinery of exclusion, how a society dismantles lives not by bombs, but by bureaucratic edits. Among the youth, the transformation was jubilant. Boys like Alphonse Heck joined the Hitler Youth with fervor. To Alphonse, raised in the economic wreckage of post-World War I Germany, the movement offered purpose. There were uniforms, chants, discipline. He felt pride marching in lockstep, screaming slogans, holding a dagger etched with Nazi ideals. At first, it seemed like harmless patriotism, hikes, teamwork, flag ceremonies, but soon the moral cost grew. Members were asked to report anti-Nazi comments. Even from family, Alphonse's loyalty shifted. The state replaced the household as the moral compass. At the heart of power, Hedwig Potthast sat behind a typewriter in Hitler's inner circle. As one of his private secretaries, she typed letters, scheduled meetings, and transcribed dictated orders. In her letters home, she spoke of uniforms and formality, of a regime that appeared organized and unstoppable. But the Polish didn't conceal everything. Hedwig noticed the disappearances, the aide who was suddenly reassigned, the silence that followed an overheard joke. The atmosphere around Hitler was reverent but brittle. No one laughed freely. She never voiced doubts aloud. But in her writing, traces of hesitation bled through. Meanwhile, in a quiet Berlin neighborhood, Martha Lieberman, a cultured Jewish woman married into one of Germany's most prominent families, began to feel her social fabric unravel. Her name, once respected, became a liability. Old friends stopped inviting her. The family physician canceled appointments. Her neighbors turned their heads when they passed her on the street. She was not arrested or shouted at. Her exclusion was slower, an erosion of contact, a deliberate forgetting. It was a loneliness engineered by law and amplified by silence. The regime's strength lay not only in its violence, but in its ability to turn ordinary people into instruments of conformity. Propaganda saturated daily life. Radios blared Hitler's speeches in cafes and town squares. Films glorified Aryan ideals. School books were rewritten to reflect Nazi ideology. Even mathematics problems emphasized racial statistics. Churches were told to display the swastika beside the crucifix. The Reich did not merely control laws, it occupied imagination. Yet there were moments, fleeting, fragile, where the illusion cracked. Elizabeth once saw her teacher's hands tremble as he recited party doctrine. Victor received a letter from an old student expressing regret. Alphonse watched his grandmother flinch when he saluted in uniform. Hedwig paused before stamping a name onto a list. Martha, while walking home, received a nod from a former friend, quick, furtive, and heavy, with an unspoken apology. These were not acts of rebellion, but fragments of awareness, echoes of conscience in a landscape growing steadily deaf. The year 1936 brought a new performance. Berlin hosted the Summer Olympics, and the regime masked its repression under flags and fanfare. Anti-Jewish signs were temporarily removed from shops. Foreign journalists were carefully managed. The world saw an efficient, unified Germany. Within the country, the message was clear. The Reich was powerful, orderly, inevitable. Any resistance, any hesitation could only lead to isolation or worse. For civilians, the danger lay not just in defying the regime, but in being seen not applauding loud enough. The cost of privacy grew daily. Conversations became cautious. Letters were burned. Children were taught to report their parents. It was not merely a dictatorship. It was a surveillance of the soul. Still, not all were passive. In sermons, some pastors, like Martin Niemöller, spoke thinly veiled truths. Artists embedded subversion in their work. Friends passed forbidden books hand to hand. These actions were rare and risky, but they existed. And for many, survival itself became an act of quiet defiance. By the end of 1936, Nazi power felt immovable. The promises of unity and renewal had given way to fear and suspicion. People adapted because adaptation was survival. But the cost of that adaptation, of nodding along, of looking away, was profound. In homes and offices, in parishes and classrooms, the question of how to live under the regime became a moral puzzle with no clean answers. Elizabeth learned to pray silently. Victor continued to write. Alphonse rose in rank. Hedwig grew more guarded. Martha became invisible. The Nazi regime reshaped Germany not only through force, but through seduction, obedience, and fear. And in that landscape, the most human acts, remembering, doubting, grieving, became quietly political. It was not just a question of survival, but of retaining the capacity to feel. Promise and paranoia were not opposites. They walked hand in hand. and in the space between them, the story of ordinary Germans began to darken. Conformity and conflict, 1935 to 1939. If the early years of Nazi rule planted fear and silence, the years that followed hardened that silence into law. Victor Klemperer continued to write. Each new decree was inked into his diary not with outrage, but with weary disbelief. When the Nuremberg laws were passed in 1935, Klemperer understood what had once seemed unthinkable was now legal reality. Jews were stripped of citizenship. Intermarriage was banned. Public life shrank further for those labeled racially impure. I belong no longer to mankind, only to the Jews, he wrote. It wasn't merely the exclusion, it was the speed and ease with which it was accepted. What made it unbearable, he noted, was not always the law itself, but the silence of colleagues, the quick withdrawal of friendships, the shifting of eyes in the hallway. No protests, just absence. In Stuttgart, Anna Haag, a teacher and writer, watched her classroom change. Jewish students were expelled. Nazi ideology seeped into her curriculum. But unlike many of her peers, Haag quietly resisted. She kept a coded diary, locking away her thoughts in a secret drawer. She worried for the children who vanished from her lessons and condemned the apathy she saw in the staff room. Her prose was careful but searing. What is to become of us who see but remain silent, she asked herself. For Haag, teaching became an act of internal rebellion, keeping the human alive in a world growing monstrous. In working-class Hamburg, Elise and Otto Hampel were not revolutionaries. They were ordinary people. She worked in a factory. He was a postman. They believed in order, in hard work. They voted for the Nazis once, but after Elise's brother was killed in the war, something inside them broke. His death was quickly exploited by party propaganda. The loss wasn't mourned, but marched. No space was left for grief. That rupture sparked a slow, smoldering distrust. It would take years before the Hampels acted on it, but the seeds of resistance were sown not in ideology but in grief and the coldness with which it was received. By 1938, the regime's escalation reached a terrifying crescendo. On the night of November 9th to 10th, Kristallnacht shattered any illusion that Germany's violence was hidden or spontaneous. It was methodical. Synagogues across the country were burned, Jewish businesses were smashed and looted. Over 30,000 Jews were arrested. The streets glittered with broken glass, but the noise that haunted survivors most was the silence of their neighbors. No one intervened. Very few protested. Margaret Buber-Neumann heard from friends what had happened. She herself was already marked as an enemy of the state, a former communist, imprisoned and eventually sent to Ravensbrück. But Kristallnacht chilled her, not just for its violence, but for how openly it was carried out. The world was watching, she would later write, and still it burned. Even those who disagreed, who recoiled from the brutality, stayed silent. Fear was now a civic instinct. Self-preservation trumped outrage. For the Jewish community, Kristallnacht wasn't just a pogrom. It was a message. You are not safe, and no one will help. Even among those who weren't Jewish or politically marked, the tension was mounting. Käthe Kollwitz, the renowned artist and pacifist, had spent years honoring the grief of war. Her etchings, filled with mourning mothers and lost sons, stood in stark contrast to Nazi propaganda glorifying death for the fatherland. She had lost her own son in World War I, a wound that never healed. Kollwitz refused to let that loss be used for nationalist myth-making. When asked to produce work celebrating military sacrifice, she declined. Her refusal was not loud, but it was noticed. In 1936, she was expelled from the Prussian Academy of Arts. She lived in quiet isolation. Her art censored, her voice silenced, but she never stopped drawing. Each sketch a quiet scream. What unified these disparate stories was not ideology, but moral tension. Conformity was rewarded, doubt was dangerous, and yet throughout Germany, small acts of resistance, of memory, of compassion, of grief persisted. They didn't change laws, but they preserved something more fragile, the idea that not everyone agreed, even if few dared say it. Among the general population, lines began to harden. Children were taught to report parents who criticized Hitler. The Hitler Youth expanded. The League of German Girls pushed female submission disguised as patriotic service. Religion was carefully tolerated, then slowly compromised. Churches that resisted too openly were targeted. Pastors who strayed from the script were arrested. The Gestapo encouraged informants. Entire neighborhoods became ears and eyes for the state. But even within the enforcement, cracks appeared. Not all Nazis were true believers. Some joined for job security. Others convinced themselves they were simply surviving. Bureaucrats who processed deportation orders might never have seen a concentration camp, but they still played their part. The machinery of persecution was not powered by monsters alone. It ran on compromise, ambition, and cowardice. By 1939, with war looming, the regime felt omnipresent. Radios pumped out propaganda. Newspapers celebrated conquest. The economy was tightly controlled. Dissent was criminal. And yet, beneath the surface, tension brewed. The moral cost of conformity had begun to weigh on the quiet and the thoughtful. Teachers like Anna Hogg, artists like Kollwitz, couples like the Hampels, survivors like Buber Neumann, witnesses like Klemperer. Each of them occupied a different part of society, but all were shaped by the same fear, and all resisted in their own fragile human way. This chapter in Nazi Germany's history is not about armies or speeches, it's about choices, thousands of small ones. A teacher's decision to speak kindly to a Jewish child, a mother's refusal to send her daughter to a Nazi youth rally, a worker's quiet refusal to greet with Heil Hitler. None of these stopped the Reich, but they meant something. They still do. As war approached, the mask of civility slipped further. Violence became not the exception, but the rule. And yet, even in this tightening grip, the resistance of conscience persisted, not in grand revolts, but in diaries, in drawings, in whispers across the dinner table. War and Survival, 1939 to 1943. When the war began, it did not explode into every household at once. It crept in through the silence of missing fathers, through the blackouts at dusk, through the sudden scarcity of butter, coffee, and soap. By 1939, Hitler's vision had become reality. Germany was marching, but for the people at home, the war would be less about triumph and more about survival. Inge Scholl, older sister to Sophie and Hans, remembered the subtle shifts that war demanded. Rationing tightened, food lines lengthened, coffee became ersatz, a bitter imitation. Families learned to barter, a bit of lard for a few potatoes, a child's coat exchanged for firewood. Mothers turned to their neighbors not just for flour, but for comfort, for whispers, for any sign of what lay ahead. To live was to improvise. To eat was to plan a week in advance. Cities like Dresden and Hamburg, beautiful Baroque, became battlegrounds not in resistance but in endurance. The bombs came at night. Marie Neumann, a teacher in Dresden, described the moments between the sirens and the falling fire. She remembered the way her hands shook while lacing her son's shoes, the way the basement walls seemed to breathe as they waited. Some prayed. Others simply counted the seconds between each boom. Afterward, there were no words, just dust and glass, and the impossible task of trying to locate familiar streets in an unfamiliar landscape. She wrote in her diary, "The city looks like a lung that has stopped breathing." Hamburg fared no better. Operation Gomorrah in 1943 left over 30,000 dead. Survivors crawled out of cellars into a city that had vanished. There were bodies in the canals, firestorms that consumed the air itself, and still, people went to work the next day. To endure was to move, not to mourn. In Berlin, the tension was different, closer to power, but not protected from fear. Writer Hans Fallada lived just blocks from the ministries that dictated life and death. By now, he was a broken man, mentally fragile, politically ambivalent, and deeply observant. He wrote not as a hero, but as a witness. In his novel, Every Man Dies Alone, based on the real-life resistance of Otto and Elise Hampel, Fallada captured the quiet despair of those who refused to comply and the suffocating absurdity of a system that punished grief as treason. His Berlin was a place of shadows, where truth was passed in folded notes, and resistance came in the form of postcards left in stairwells. For Fallada, survival was not just physical, it was psychological. It was choosing every day not to go mad. Traudl Junge entered this world much differently. As Hitler's personal secretary, she lived in the cocooned luxury of the Reich Chancellery and later the Führer bunker. Her war was typed in reports, masked by protocol. And yet, even she could not ignore the growing chasm between what the party claimed and what the world revealed. By 1943, while Berliners starved, Junge dined on meats and desserts. She described the atmosphere in Hitler's inner circle as tight, heavy, almost like a stage play performed over and over. She would later reflect, "I was young, I wanted a career, I didn't look." But outside those walls, Germany was bleeding. Children like Alphonse Heck, once a proud member of the Hitler Youth, began to notice the cracks. At first, war was romantic, uniforms, parades, heroism. But as the months turned to years and friends stopped coming back from the front and letters arrived with black-edged envelopes, even the most loyal began to falter. Heck remembered standing in a town square, watching captured soldiers limp past. "They looked like us," he wrote, "but we were told they were not human." Doubt crept in slowly, first as confusion, then as shame. The war redefined intimacy. Families were torn apart, not just by conscription or bombing, but by belief. Children were taught to spy on their parents. Wives feared saying too much in public. Friends disappeared overnight. The Gestapo was not everywhere, but it might be anywhere. Still, in the margins of fear, life continued. People fell in love. Babies were born in basements. School teachers found ways to teach history that didn't glorify Hitler. Musicians played Bach instead of Wagner, quietly. Each choice was a small resistance, a refusal to let the regime define the full extent of German identity. For the Jewish population still within Germany, survival was a vanishing possibility. Deportations began in earnest by 1941. The term was resettlement, but few believed the euphemisms anymore. Inga Scholl recalled seeing classmates vanish without notice. Their desks remained empty. No one asked why, no one dared. Those who hid did so at extraordinary risk. Entire families lived in attics and closets and barns. Children were taught not to cry. Helpers were imprisoned or worse, and yet help did come from nuns, from farmers, from the quietly brave. In the cities, propaganda still boomed. Radio broadcasts claimed victory even as ruins piled higher. People learned to read between the lines. A sudden silence on a certain front meant disaster. A minister's absence from the radio suggested arrest. Truth was coded and understood only in fragments. By 1943, the illusion of Nazi invincibility was gone. The siege of Stalingrad ended in catastrophic defeat. Whispers of Allied advances circulated. Hope returned, but it came with danger. To express optimism was treason. To expect liberation was naive. And yet many began to prepare. Food was hidden, documents forged, routes plotted. Even those who had once shouted the loudest began to grow quiet. Hitler's speeches, once thunderous, sounded brittle, more like incantations than declarations. And for those inside his bunker, like Junge, the dissonance between words and world was no longer deniable. Germany had become a country of rubble, ration cards, and rumor, but also of resilience. It had been 4 years of bombing, of betrayals, of brown shirts and blackouts, and still, people found ways to survive. Not always nobly, not always cleanly, but with a stubborn will to endure. The war was not over. Its worst chapters were yet to come. But by 1943, something had shifted. The mask of omnipotence had slipped, and beneath it was a regime desperate, cracking, afraid, resistance and remorse. 1943 to 1945. By 1943, the tide of war had begun to turn, and with it, the tide of belief. For a decade, the Nazi regime had demanded obedience through fear, spectacle, and law. But as Germany's victories collapsed into defeats and Allied bombers scorched cities by night, something else began to stir in the hearts of civilians. Not hope exactly, but conscience. The cracks in the Reich were no longer just on the map. They were moral, spiritual, personal. For some, this meant action. For others, it meant shame. In Munich, at the heart of Nazi academia, a quiet rebellion unfolded, not with rifles, but with leaflets. Sophie Scholl, a university student along with her brother Hans and a circle of friends, formed the White Rose movement. They wrote, printed, and distributed flyers denouncing Hitler's crimes and calling for non-violent resistance. "We will not be silent," one leaflet declared. They knew what it meant to speak so boldly in such a regime. Sophie, only 21, was arrested alongside Hans in February 1943. At her trial, she refused to deny her words. She was executed by guillotine hours later. The regime had hoped to bury her dissent. Instead, it awakened something deeper, an unsettling awareness that even the young could see the truth. Far from Munich, in the pews of a small Protestant church, Elisabeth Käsemann listened differently. She was only a teenager, but the war had aged her. Her father, a pastor aligned with the confessing church, occasionally dared to hint at injustice from the pulpit, but even that was rare. Elizabeth began to ask, why does the church not speak out? Why do Christians sing hymns while others scream in camps? These were not questions she voiced aloud. They lived in her bones, in her journal, in the tension she carried through every sermon. Years later, her activism would take her across borders. But here, in wartime Germany, it began with silence and the urge to break it. Some forms of resistance never reached the public at all. In the small town of Laubach, civil servant Friedrich Kellner wrote a diary. It was not meant for publication nor propaganda. It was a record, a moral ledger. Day after day, he documented the lies, the brutality, the collective amnesia of those around him. In one entry, he wrote, "Those who stand by and do nothing are also guilty." His was not a story of sabotage or public protest. It was the resistance of truth-telling in private, the refusal to let madness go unrecorded. "I want the future to know," he wrote, "we were not all like them." For women like Krista Winslow, a writer and sculptor, resistance took a subtler form. She had already fallen out of favor with the regime. Her early work celebrated female independence and queerness, anathema to Nazi ideals. As the war dragged on, her home became a quiet space of dissent, a refuge for conversation and art untouched by propaganda. She didn't organize sales or distribute leaflets, but she created spaces where honesty could survive, even flourish. It was dangerous and deeply private. Her letters reveal an enduring rage, not only at the regime, but at the passivity of neighbors, the deafness of the outside world, the loneliness of knowing too much. Then there were those who spoke through journalism until they could no longer speak. Wilhelm Gudorf, a journalist and intellectual, had been involved in the underground resistance group later dubbed the Red Orchestra. They gathered intelligence, distributed anti-Nazi literature, and attempted to forge links with foreign governments. Gudorf's writing was sharp, fearless, unflinching. He believed truth could pierce even the thickest fog of fear. But in 1942, he was arrested by the Gestapo. Before his execution, he wrote letters home, calm, resolved, proud of the stand he had taken. "I have lived in truth," he said. "I will die with it." By 1944, Germany itself was beginning to implode. The July 20th plot, an attempt by military officers to assassinate Hitler, failed. But its ripples spread wide. Thousands were arrested. Even those tangentially connected to dissent faced death. Fear returned, more savage than before. The Gestapo grew frantic, the propaganda louder, the punishment crueler. And yet something had shifted. Dissent was no longer rare. It was spreading like cracks in ice. Not all acted, but more began to doubt, to question, to feel remorse. Many of those who had once cheered the Führer now walked through streets lined with rubble, carrying buckets of water past the burnt shells of their homes. Children returned from Hitler youth camps with questions. Soldiers returned from the Eastern Front silent, haunted. Some civilians learned at last what the camps truly were, and then came the guilt. Remorse did not arrive with a trumpet. It came in the quiet, a letter never sent, a cross placed not for nationalism, but mourning, a neighbor's name remembered too late. Germans who had once embraced conformity began to confront themselves, not all, but some. In Berlin, Hans Fallada wrote his final novel, Every Man Dies Alone, based on the real-life resistance of Otto and Elise Hampel. It was a story not of triumph, but of dignity in futility. Their resistance had changed nothing. They were caught, executed, but their defiance, small, stubborn, mattered. In Fallada's hands, it became a portrait of the moral cost of silence. This chapter of the civilian story is not about the heroic overthrow of tyranny. That never came. It's about those who found, even in the darkest hour, the courage to say no, or the clarity to whisper, "I was wrong." Resistance, for many, was not a plan. It was a moment, a decision not to salute, a choice to listen, a refusal to pretend. Some survived, many did not. But what ties them together is not success, it is conviction. The war would end in ruins, but long before the bombs stopped falling, the war within the conscience of a nation had begun. Some lost, others endured, and a few, despite everything, resisted. Collapse and reckoning. 1945 and beyond. The war ended not with a sudden silence, but with a series of crashing defeats of cities, of illusions, of identities. Germany, once thunderous with rallies and marching boots, now lay in ruins. The Reich that promised 1,000 years crumbled in 12. The final days were a spectacle of desperation. Hitler dead in his bunker, Goebbels poisoning his children, SS officers fleeing or shooting themselves, and civilians, once obedient, once proud, now sifting through rubble, searching for food, shelter, or meaning. For many Germans, the fall of Berlin was not liberation, but a collapse into the unknown. What followed was not peace, but reckoning. Soldiers returned from the front with hollow eyes. Families were torn apart, some by loss, others by guilt. Children who had paraded in Hitler Youth uniforms watched the swastikas pulled down, replaced by Allied flags. The silence that followed the bombs was heavy with questions. What did we believe? What did we do? What did we ignore? Marlene Dietrich returned to Germany not as a film star, but in the uniform of the U.S. Army. She had fled the country early, rejecting the regime's propaganda and the cinematic world that once made her famous. Now, she walked through the ruins of her homeland, offering performances to Allied troops, avoiding the gaze of civilians who remembered her and judged her. She had chosen exile over complicity. She had paid the price in estrangement, but she came back to sing to the broken, to stare down the wreckage, and to mourn. Victor Klemperer, who had survived in hiding under a false identity, emerged into the ruins of Dresden, a city no longer recognizable, flattened by Allied firebombing. His diary did not stop. The very act of recording, of writing through terror, and now through aftermath, was his resistance. In May 1945, he walked the scorched streets, noting how the ruins still whispered of what had been. "The ashes are warm with stories that must not be forgotten," he wrote. But Klemperer also feared the ease with which people would forget. Even as the regime collapsed, he saw signs of selective memory, of people distancing themselves from their past. Margarete Buber-Neumann had lived through the worst of it, first imprisoned by Stalin, then handed over to Hitler's Gestapo. Under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, she had survived 2 totalitarian systems, Soviet and Nazi. Ravensbrück had left her emaciated, but not voiceless. After the war, she became one of the most powerful witnesses to the century's horrors, warning against the seductions of both fascism and communism. She spoke in courtrooms, in public forums, in books. Her body carried the scars of imprisonment, but her mind remained fiercely lucid. She insisted on naming the perpetrators, on refusing to let euphemism soften what had happened. The German public was forced to confront the unimaginable. The Allies made certain of that. Photographs from Buchenwald, Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, and Dachau were published in newspapers. Newsreels played in cinemas. Entire towns were marched through nearby camps, forced to witness the crimes carried out in their name, or at least in their silence. Some civilians broke down in horror. Others looked away. Some denied it, claiming ignorance. But the images were undeniable. Piles of corpses, survivors with skeletal bodies and hollow eyes, gas chambers, crematoria. The evidence refused to be buried. Denazification began, uneven, inconsistent, but symbolically significant. Trials were held in Nuremberg. The world watched. The Nazi leaders, stripped of their uniforms and rhetoric, were asked to answer for their crimes. Some, like Hans Fritzsche, a senior propagandist, claimed they were simply broadcasters of orders, not makers of policy. Others, like Louisa Dance, a female guard at Majdanek, were confronted with testimonies of beatings, selections, and death marches. The defense of just following orders echoed in courtroom after courtroom. Friedrich Kellner, a civil servant from a small town, had spent the war years writing a secret diary. Unlike many, he had seen through the lies. His entries were filled with condemnation, not just of the Nazi leaders, but of the society that enabled them. "Those who stand by and do nothing are also guilty," he wrote in 1942, and again after the war. When the reckoning arrived, he did not feel vindicated. He felt sorrow for the wasted years, the lost lives, and the complicity of neighbors he once trusted. In the years following 1945, the language of guilt took on different forms. There was Schuld, legal guilt, and there was shame. Many denied the former, but most felt the latter. Children asked their parents, "Where were you?" Some got silent. Others heard carefully edited stories. A generation of Germans grew up in the long shadow of defeat and denial, forced to unlearn the myths their textbooks once taught them. Some civilians tried to rebuild not just homes, but moral ground. Women like Krista Winslow, who had long expressed her outrage in whispers and journals, now published essays, painted, or simply told the truth to their children. Churches held services of confession. Schools rewrote their curricula, and yet the past could not be cleansed so easily. For survivors, the burden was heavier. Returnees from camps found their homes occupied, their families gone, their trauma dismissed. Anti-Semitism didn't vanish with Hitler's death. Many Jews emigrated, unwilling to rebuild lives among those who had watched them disappear. And yet some stayed, determined to reclaim not just property, but presence. Reconstruction brought economic miracles. West Germany rebuilt, East Germany reshaped itself under Soviet influence, but beneath the surface, the memory of war and complicity lingered like ash in the foundation stones. Artists like Käthe Kollwitz were rehabilitated posthumously, their work displayed as symbols of moral clarity. Writers like Hans Fallada, who had captured wartime despair in novels like Every Man Dies Alone, became quiet prophets of national conscience. The reckoning was not singular. It came in waves, in trials, in family dinners, and school debates. It came in documentaries and literature and poetry. It came in the refusal to forget. It came, sometimes too late, but it came. And still, questions endured. Could more have been done? Why did so many believe? How does a society built on culture, philosophy, and reason descend into barbarity so quickly? These were not questions for historians alone. They were questions asked by ordinary people in churches, classrooms, city halls. The answers were complex, painful, often incomplete, but the asking itself was essential. The collapse of the Third Reich left behind more than rubble. It left behind moral ruins. And in the decades that followed, Germany began the slow, difficult work of rebuilding not just cities, but conscience, through memory, through education, through acknowledgement. This was not about absolution. It is about recognition of what was done, of what was allowed, of what must never be allowed again. And though the war ended in 1945, the reckoning never truly does. History doesn't only speak through battles or speeches. Sometimes it murmurs through diaries, letters, and silences held too long. The lives of Sophie Scholl, Victor Klemperer, Elizabeth Kassmann, and countless others reveal what it meant to live and choose under tyranny. Most stayed quiet. A few stood tall. All were changed. As we look back, one question lingers. In their world, what would you have done?